welcome to the first event of a two-day event thinking about car culture in our city. This is the first panel discussion, and there's a series of events tomorrow, mostly around the singing tree. And there should be a link to however you got to here with how to sign up for the events tomorrow. But this panel discussion brings experts together from both sides of the Atlantic to think critically about cities, and in particularly the city that we currently reside in, Birmingham, England. So I'd like to start first by thanking John Munro, whose passion to make this city and other cities better is infectious. I think we could probably all say that we are here because of John Munro, whether or not we've met John Munro physically or we've met his alter ego on Twitter. John Munro has brought us here. I'd also like to thank the Center for the Study of North America and the Birmingham Research Institute for Histories and Cultures at the University of Birmingham, and the local community activist group Civic Square for their generous funding and helping organize this event. So today we're going to be talking about, in this event, this panel, we're going to be talking about what is public space for. And John has asked me to give some very brief opening remarks. 30 years ago, historical geographer Mike Davis warned that Los Angeles, and by extension, the future of the American city, was, quote, inexorably moving to extinguish its last real public spaces, with all of their democratic intoxications, risks, and undeodorized odors. In the postmodern city, Davis went on, quote, public amenities are radically shrinking, parks are becoming derelict, and beaches more segregated. Libraries and playgrounds are closing, youth congregations of ordinary kinds are banned, and the streets are becoming more desolate and dangerous, end quote. And yet, in his discussion of the neoliberalization of public space, something is curiously, or perhaps not so curiously, missing from Davis's analysis: cars. Indeed, automobiles, cars, roads, streets, and highways don't even make what is otherwise a detailed index of the book, although I think they're obviously tangentially there. The street and the road, once perhaps the critical public and democratic space of urban environments the world over, are hidden in a city not of courts, but a city of cars. So the panel we have assembled here today is going to turn its attention to what is public space for, and how we might return to a democratic and public use of a crucial piece of public space. And I think the choice is ours. We have a choice of what our public spaces will look like. The panelists have been asked to talk for roughly 10 minutes. After they've each spoken, they will have a short conversation amongst themselves, responding to each other's points before we open the floor to Q&A. For the sake of clarity, I'll provide a biographical sketch of each of our panelists before they speak, but I thought I could introduce their names first. To my right, we have Danni Ebanks-Ingram. Right. Next to them is Simon Jackson. And then we have Tom Flood. And online, hidden behind the Zoom app square, we have Daisy Narayanan and Rachel Lee. So we'll start the panel off with Tom Flood, who's come across from Canada to be here with us today.
Awesome. So I've actually got to go over there.
You got to go there. While you're going over there, I will talk about introducing you. Tom Flood has worked in marketing, advertising for many years in Toronto, working on a wide range of clients, including corporate branding for automotive manufacturers. Things changed direction for him when he took his kids to school on their bikes and truly saw a serious imbalance in shared spaces. He has most recently been developing creative content through Rovello Creative, and he gives talks and workshops around framing and language as it applies to AT, active transit, road safety, and road violence. He continues to work in marketing and does so in Hamilton, Ontario, where he lives with his partner and two kids.
Okay, let's see if this comes up as presenter view. Oh, awesome. Do I need this one?
Yes, you do. That's a separate recording.
Okay, hold on. Okay, awesome. Thanks so much for having me here, and thanks to everybody that's been a part of putting this on. As always, before I kind of start these talks, it's a very strange space for me to be in, because it's never been of intention to be in this space, is that I come at this from a marketing perspective as shared, but maybe more importantly is I was simply a parent that wanted to get their kids to school both safely and independently. That's kind of the lens that, you know, helped shape my perspective and really what brought me into this space. So, you know, who is public space for? So there are many ways to dissect this discussion. I'm going to be talking, for me, kind of simple movement for people outside of the car. This picture, as you can see, is an unpassable, you know, unwalkable sidewalk next to a 5-lane, one-way road in the heart of the city that I live in. And this was a specific choice, but this was a choice by the city, not the person walking there. It was a choice. It speaks volumes to who we prioritize and where we place value in people's movement. So this is a member of our senior community, but I said children's movement is what kind of woke me up to this space. So these are my 2 kids. I talk about them a lot because they are obviously a massive part of my life. But the light bulb really didn't go off for me in this space until I took them to school for the very first time on their bikes. It was absolutely horrifying to see the imbalance on our streets and just how dangerous it was to get these kids to school and daycare. It was shocking, truly, and I think most people might have that revelation in different times, but for me, that was the moment. This is what our school ride looked like. So this is I'm going to show some images here from the street that we had to cross every single day to get to school. This is a 6-block stretch of a street called Queen Street. Transit shelters destroyed, vehicles on pedestrian refuges flipped over. You can see that pickup truck. Vehicles on narrow sidewalks crashed on the sidewalks. More vehicles crashed on the sidewalks, flipped in the middle of the road. This is one street that we had to cross every single day. You know, what should have been kind of a joyous, if not mundane experience with me and the children was extremely harrowing. It was essentially started off in the morning. I was rallying the troops, and by the end of it, you know, I'm screaming at the drivers to be safe, and I'm yelling at my kids to just please, you know, kids, watch out. It wasn't the joyous experience that this exercise should be. So it wasn't always as, you know, visually dramatic as this, but when the margin of error is so low and the cost is so high, that's how it feels a lot of the time, that a lot is on the line with every single movement as we move to the public. And this is kind of the kids' first entry into moving through our public spaces, getting to school. It's a pretty basic, a basic starter for them. So if you look at, let's say, that transit shelter that's destroyed, which is a little island it's on, you look at the pedestrian refuge, the vehicles that are crashed on the side, those narrow sidewalks, we have to ask ourselves, who are these spaces for? Are they for the people that are supposed to be taking the bus, walking to school, or are they designed to, you know, minimize impact to, let's say, vehicular traffic or, you know, perceived driver convenience? And I know the answer to this street because what we did, we had this street redesigned and none of those issues were actually addressed. So what they did was they converted this from a part-way to one-way to a full 2-way, and nothing else was done other than painting a line down the middle of the road. So it was a real opportunity lost. And then I think, you know, who do the key players in our city, who do they think public space is for? Who do our leaders think? So I'll use this street as an example. The same street, another block and a half down from those. Here's a councillor's reactions to, you know, some minor improvements that community was trying to push forward to make this street a little bit safer prior to that conversion. If you don't want to live on a busy street, don't buy a house there. I'm getting really tired of parochial lower city councillors wanting to turn our arterial roads into local streets. Right? What a beautiful world this person paints. What a visionary. So, but this is the kind of reaction we get when we want to make small adjustments and shift to make things a little less automotive and a little more human. So, you know, who is public space for? Well, according to some of our councillors, it's a place for drivers to crash into each other rather than for kids walking to school. I'm going to stay on this theme of movement, kids to school, because that's what brought me to this space. There's a school here on the far right marked with that little red flag. On the right side of that marked yellow road, the kids can walk, bike, roll, be driven as needed to their school. On the left side of that marked road, the school board has to provide busing. And they provide busing because that road that's marked there has too many hazards or conflict points. So we have such dangerous spaces that instead of, fixing these spaces and providing more human-centric spaces and safe systems for these kids to simply get to school, what do? We just put them in a vehicle. That's our solution. And again, it speaks volume to who these spaces are for. This is a kid's entire life on that screen. Your house, your school, your friends' houses, and the local park, right? This is where they make connections. This is where they live. But we've imposed very strict boundaries, and we've imposed them to really better service the automobile. There's really no other reason for that. And so this is active transportation. Unfortunately, we're just actively putting these kids into automobiles rather than them actively walking or rolling to school. Okay, so I also did an audit of an intersection last spring with another elementary school. It was a part of, it was with a group that's working on to remove barriers for kids getting to primary school. Credible group. But they had such incredible insight, these kids. So what they said was, driver, a lot of the things won't be a surprise to us, but hearing it from kids is pretty powerful and very, very impactful. Speeding drivers, short cross times, drivers going through reds, feeling rushed. They felt like a nuisance. And that's something that I think we all can feel, even as we get older, but that culture of the car has been imposed on us from such an early age that simply walking across the school or walking across the street to go to school, you feel like a nuisance, like you're in the way. It's heartbreaking. And so I share this because after this audit, a parent of one of the students sent me a document that her daughter had sent to the school in the city about this very intersection 2 years prior. And she sent it with some tips to the city and outlining some information. So here we go. Let's see what she says here. People still turning left when it's not their turn. People speed. People turn right trying to beat the crossing guard. Or I think it's lollipop, or yeah. So beat the crossing guard. This is outrageous. Like what are our kids dealing with in public here? People try to go around me when I'm crossing. It's very slippery. And then the red X's indicate the locations where I've almost been hit. Right? Think about that. I mean, they're telling us exactly how we need to design these streets, but we don't listen in a lot of the cases. And this is the second page that was attached. My dad had to push me out of the way of a truck, otherwise I could have died. Then I had to watch him stumble backwards and bang the hood to get the driver's attention. Right? These are 8-year-olds just crossing the street to go to school. So who is public space for? Well, think about who we continually design, approve, build, and defend and see spaces for, and then how it applies to this extremely basic movement that every kid should have the opportunity, if able, to be able to do. We know the problem, we know the solution, we just really choose to not really address it. So we have these dangerous and extremely hostile spaces for kids to navigate as a baseline, we know that. So what do we do, right, as a society and a community? Well, we don't do much, and then we shame them to be essentially perfect with all sorts of different, campaigning and awareness days, all sorts of things like that. This shot here is from the Utah Department of Transportation, and it's a communication explaining how you should walk single file when in groups on these narrow sidewalks that they've built and implemented, of course. It's quite possibly the most dystopian imagery I think I've ever seen. They're hunched over, faceless, lifeless humans, like submitting to a life built for cars. I honestly can't even believe that they were able to capture despair in a vector drawing. It's truly incredible. And if you think it's just the vector drawing how we position these children in public space, well, we also do it with our photography. This child fits right into this sad vision that we have for kids outside and in public. But this is how we see people and children in public. What we do is we continually remove all joy, from this public life, and we convert it into some sort of perverse driver convenience. That's what it feels like to me a lot of the time, is that we take public joy, what could be public joy, and convert that into driver convenience. Perceived driver convenience, I should say. Okay, I'm almost 10 minutes, I'm sorry. Okay, okay. And at the same time that we shame them with these campaigns and, wear your vest, wear your neon, light up, we fill our public spaces with vehicles that are 9,000 pounds, 1,000 horsepower, and go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, right? It's absurd. We tell them to watch out, right? Be careful, kids. Really be careful out there. We ask our kids, and I've said this a few times, but we ask our kids to be absolutely perfect. So our designs and the drivers don't have to be, right? We put everything on them to be safe. And it has a huge impact on our public spaces because, we continually build for the automobile and then we try to retrofit people back into it and it doesn't work. So their connection to community is constantly interrupted by this continual prioritization of the driver. We hear a lot about kids being on screen, stuck on YouTube. I complain about my own kids being on YouTube too much, but they weren't out there like we were when we were kids. We were all out there having a great time. Well, there's a lot of reasons for this, but we can't continue to ignore that 2 to 3 ton elephant that dominates all of our spaces. Nothing says car culture like a driver hitting a child on a bike, the driver not getting out of the car, the child apologizes essentially, and then the driver simply drives away. How did we get here? How did we get to this point? He's just biking on his street. This is not something out of the ordinary that we're running into. If we give our kids, safe spaces and access to those spaces, which is kind of the key, they will thrive. These are my kids with a couple of their friends, and of course they're playing hockey. We're Canadian, but this is a park that's accessible to them to go to without supervision. So they've got a way to get to a park without an adult. They can play at a park as long as they want without an adult. So they're getting their independence. We all know what our prioritization of the driver is taken away, but this is what they can have back too. They can have things like this. They crave this independence, but we've really turned them into martyrs, for this cause they don't even understand, and it's really heartbreaking when you start to really unpack it and really start to see it. So who is public space for? Well, it should be for everyone, but our government dictated roads have really put such strict boundaries for essentially anybody that's not in a car. And one way to determine it is, right, who are we seeing out there? But another way is, who aren't we seeing in public? Who's not out there? So to me, the bottom line when it comes to, when it comes to our spaces, we seem to care a lot more about people driving than we do necessarily people living. And obviously this is probably not a lot of big news here to some sitting here, but a lot of people don't see that. Because we've done such an incredible job of normalizing this imbalance. The fact that getting to school is an issue is ridiculous. It's completely absurd. And the moment for me when it happened, I haven't stopped talking about it because it still shocks me to this day that it's an issue. But because we've essentially made it so that automobiles can go pretty much everywhere at the expense of children going anywhere. And that's kind of the bottom line for me. And when I think of public space, this is not what I want, but this is the reality right now, and we've just got to do a lot better job to get to a better and new reality and wake up people to the imbalance. That's my 13 minutes. Sorry, John. All right, now I'll take that off the screen. That's all right. Oh yes, 14 minutes. Sorry.
Thank you, Tom, for that clear-eyed assessment of what most of us experience on a daily basis. Next up, we are going to move online and onto Zoom to Rachel Lee of Living Streets. Rachel Lee is a policy and research manager at Living Streets. She joined the organization in 2012. She represents Living Streets externally in coalitions, expert groups, and in the media on a wide range of issues from air quality, active travel, EV charging infrastructure, health planning, to road safety. So Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi there, can everyone hear me all right? So I've got some pictures so you don't have to stare at me reading my script. Who's public space for? In principle, our roads, streets, pavements, public squares and parks should be open and accessible to the general public, so people like you and me. But in order to really answer the question of who benefits, I think we need to look at how our public spaces are being used. So there's going to be some overlap here with what Tom's talked about. Living Streets was established in 1929 as the Pedestrians Association in response to dangers posed by growing numbers of motor vehicles. Our objective, which remains the same today, is promoting the safety of the walking public and the comfort and general amenities of pedestrians. A quick look at some of our current campaigns demonstrates how the presence of vehicles still exerts a powerful influence today. So these are campaigns such as Safer Routes to Schools, banning pavement parking, tackling vehicle emissions to improve air quality, and a successful call now for a default 20-mile-an-hour limit in Wales. And we're going to be running a forthcoming campaign on crossings. During the COVID lockdowns of 2020, though, we had a reduction in motor traffic, which was combined with a requirement for social distancing, and it did open a rare opportunity for road space reallocation. Government updated the network duty guidance with advice, for example, footway widening, new cycle lanes, the introduction of school streets, reducing speed limits, introduction of pedestrian and cycle zones, and also the introduction of modal filters to create low traffic neighbourhoods. Now, within 6 months, those changes were made permanent, with the exception of widening pavements, which tells you something about how we as a society in England value vehicles, whether they're moving or parked on the carriageway. The priority given to vehicles is evident, I think, when you look across urban road networks. So we have the example sorry, I'm losing my thread, but the example of timing at signalised junctions, which dictates how long pedestrians have to wait to cross the road. Or increasingly, what we've seen is cycle lanes being taken off the road and put on wide pavements, so that pedestrians now share that space with people on bicycles. The desire to accommodate cycling without cutting traffic, which is key, is leading to new types of infrastructure, such as bus stop bypasses and new tensions. So the fear of crossing the cycle lane could prevent a person with sight loss from using that type of bus stop, and so restrict their ability to travel independently. Visual communication through movement and looking, or not looking, is the primary means of negotiating priority when pedestrians, cyclists and drivers are brought in contact with one another. And this brings a unique set of challenges for people with sight loss, and it can also prove challenging when there are children or people with neurodevelopmental disorders. But I want to just quickly touch on shared spaces, which were brought in the sort of late noughties, because that really highlighted the problem. I'm just going to move through to this example, which is at Exhibition Road in London, which was quite notorious at the time. These are broadly characterised by the minimal use of traffic signs and other traffic management related street furniture, and particularly the removal of curbs to create a level surface. It blurs the division between the carriageway and the footway, so that drivers have to rely on cultural signals and informal social protocols. They have to reduce speed, use eye contact, and become part of their social surroundings. Now, the intention was well meant in that it was to reduce the dominance of motor vehicles and create more of a sense of place. And at the time, government guidance said these were only really suitable where there were high numbers of pedestrians and relatively low traffic flows. But it created problems, in particular for blind and partially sighted people. David Bates, who was an engineer who lost his sight at 60, set out his strategy for crossing shared spaces. So I'm just going to read this quote here. As there's no curb from which to establish a precise direction of travel, it's necessary to start with one's back touching the wall of the building, and then to walk slowly forward, scanning one's cane in the usual way, while walking slowly into the path of approaching traffic. Some drivers can get very annoyed at pedestrians who step out in front of them without looking. But it's important for a blind person to not look left or right as an approaching driver may think he's been seen, and that the pedestrian will automatically stop for him. It's also essential to walk slowly to give drivers time to see the pedestrian and stop or swerve in order to avoid an accident. So as well as missing cues from drivers or people cycling, Bates observed that blind people could inadvertently give the wrong message to other road users. And what we see with both shared spaces and bus stop bypasses are examples of how a specific group of people may be prevented from using public spaces. So in the same way that children can be prevented from walking independently to school. Now the thing is, here we do have legislation to cover this eventuality. We have the Equality Act 2010, which identifies 9 protected characteristics, and a public sector equality duty on public bodies to advance equality of opportunity and to remove or minimise disadvantages suffered between people who share relevant protected characteristics and those who don't. So some examples that are relevant here include age, sex, pregnancy and maternity, as well as disability. So for example, older people who are at risk of hip fractures from trips and falls on poorly maintained footway surfaces. Young girls who might feel excluded from spaces because they don't feel safe. And the lack of design consideration for pregnant women and nursing mothers, so places to sit and rest. I've already talked about how streets can disable blind and visually impaired pedestrians. But what about street clutter? That's a obstacle for wheeled mobility users. And here's just an example from around the corner from where I live. So although everyone knows that pavements are for pedestrians, there's competition for curbside space. And here, this is where sharing space, sorry, I'm losing my thread again, but we're talking about numerous things. It can be sharing space with cyclists, but it's also making way for outdoor dining, for EV charging infrastructure, for broadband boxes and other utilities, for e-scooter and cycle parking, for signs and lampposts, for advertising boards, guardrail, bollards or wheelie bins. These are all things that take space. So we really can't ask who public space is for without also talking about what it's used for, because each set of uses comes with its own space-taking street furniture. Broadly speaking, streets have a dual function. They're about movement, but they're also about being a place, a destination in their own right. So for instance, High Street. And this is where the situation becomes more complex because we start differentiating between public spaces and private public spaces. And this is an example not far from where I work. It's Devonshire Square. Now, these places have their uses, but it's up to the management and usually on-site security to decide who's allowed to use it. And in the case of Devonshire Square, it's actually closed at weekends. So the privatisation of public spaces and highways appears to be on the increase, certainly in England. For example, through the use of stopping up orders, where development takes way and the public highway is deemed to be no longer needed. And with it goes the public's right or freedom to access and use those spaces as they see fit. So, for example, to gather or to protest. So, more broadly, I guess the question I came back to was, who should public spaces be for? And as an organisation, Living Streets wants these streets and public spaces to be designed, putting walking first. And we know that the government's own target is for all journeys to be walked or cycled to towns and cities by 2030. But fundamentally, we believe our streets should be for everyone, providing safe and attractive places to travel, rest, play and spend time. They need to work for all of us, whatever our age, ability, gender, race or income. These are spaces where we mix sociably with strangers and where communities form. That's my answer.
For giving us perspective from this side of the Atlantic. Next, we have Daisy Narayanan. Daisy is a long-respected planning and transport expert, has been appointed to a new role, bringing together placemaking and transport strategy in the City of Edinburgh Council. Daisy is currently Director of Urbanism for Sustrans and will bring with her a wealth of experience in policy and public ground design, gained through work as an architect and urban designer in India, Singapore, England, and Scotland. She is also a member of the Edinburgh Climate Commission and Scotland's Climate Assembly Evidence Group. So will contribute expertise in this area to support the Council's zero carbon goals. I think Daisy will be giving us a perspective from Edinburgh.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And it's an absolute joy to be here. And I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person. I tried really hard, but there's so much going on right now in Edinburgh that it was just not possible. But thank you for the invitation. It's really an absolute joy to be here. Just to kind of clarify, I don't work for Sustrans anymore. That I don't know, probably must have been not updated, but I work for the City of Edinburgh Council. I used to work for Sustrans as Director of Urbanism, and everything I've learned around walking and cycling and and all of that comes from an NHS transfer, which I'm very, very grateful. But as I said, I'm Narayanan. I work for the City of Edinburgh Council. It is a new role in the council. I'm the head of placemaking and mobility. And essentially the role is one that's been put in place to bridge the disciplines of planning and transport, which is exactly the kind of thing that as urbanists, as architects, as designers, we've been saying for a long, long time. We need to make sure that the siloed working between planning and transport needs to end. So I have the absolute, again, privilege to work for the City of Edinburgh, where I am able to join those dots between planning and housing and transport and economic development, for example, and start to address some of the issues that, Tom, you showed in your slides, and Rachel, that you mentioned, that we need to pick up and really make sure that the detail of what we deliver on the ground is for everyone. I came to Scotland in 2004 to Edinburgh to complete my master's degree for 1 year, and I fell in love with this magical city. I don't know, whoever's been to Edinburgh, I think has had that moment of coming out of the station, looking back and seeing this incredible skyline, and that moment of, wow, isn't this amazing? So I do feel very fortunate that 15 years later I'm still here, working for the city as a public servant, working in partnership with amazing folk to make Edinburgh thriving and resilient and sustainable, and really put walking and cycling as at the heart of its transport strategy, which is what we have a very clear policy direction to do. But today we're here to talk about public spaces, and I must confess I haven't answered the exam question on who are public spaces for. I'm hoping that this discussion that we have helps to kind of that I can learn from it and I can take it back into my day job. But what I was looking at as I was reflecting on this session was looking to the future of urban mobility and placemaking in Edinburgh, which is my day job, but which has allowed me to kind of look back at my past. And if you would indulge me for a couple of minutes, just to talk a little bit about how I have found that where the cities and towns that I have lived in, my quality of life was influenced by how easily and conveniently and affordably I could get around. So in Bombay and Singapore, which is where I grew up, and I worked in Singapore for a while, I mostly walked everywhere to public transport, as what I needed was close to me. I used to take public transport late at night because it was safe for me. I felt safe traveling late at night, and this is more than a couple of decades ago. I lived in America for a while in a small town in the South America, and it was a beautiful, beautiful place, but I had to hop in a car to go to the gym or to get a pint of milk because there were no pavements where I lived, and I wasn't in a good place then. I was, neither physically nor mentally, and I think my dependency on the car played a big part in that. In Edinburgh and in London, I discovered the joy of cycling, getting to places quicker, feeling healthier both physically and mentally. So the design of the places that I've lived in have contributed immensely to how healthy I've felt, how active, and how productive I've been in my life. So to me, whatever I do in my job or whatever discussions I have, the technological advances that we make as we design our spaces, the future of how we design our streets, our spaces, our places, addressing some of the quite shocking pictures that Tom showed in his presentation. These designs must include, and we cannot lose the fundamental principles of equity, of affordability, of convenience, and a sense of pleasure and joy and human connection that our streets and spaces allow us to feel. And that is the point, isn't it, about connections and that key role that our public spaces play in fostering and nurturing those connections. Because as I was preparing for today this morning, I was reflecting on the role of the spaces and places in between buildings. Whether it's a grand plaza or it's a little square somewhere, whether it's an arterial route or a residential street, our parks and green spaces, we rely on these for two things. We rely on these for celebration, for all of us coming together to celebrate art and music and theatre, parades, it was a festival city. We rely on these spaces in times of distress, in times of disruption. Someone was saying the other day, which really resonated with me, when you have an earthquake, something of that seismic scale, we all come out onto our streets. During the pandemic, the biggest disruptive event we've had, it was the streets and our spaces that helped us to stay healthy in body and mind, where we could come out and connect in a safe way with others. We need these spaces for progress, for calls to action, for us to come together to say things are not working, we need to sort things out. We need our streets, we need these spaces for storytelling, so we don't forget the stories of generations of communities that have lived on these streets, along these spaces. And we need our spaces to make things better for us, little things, to make safe, pleasant spaces for kids to learn to ride their bikes, as Thomas say, to walk to school. And coming back to my lens of mobility and place, I have seen that shift in narrative as I work on the city mobility plan and the 20-minute neighborhood program and the city centre transformation project in Edinburgh, all of these which are looking to do exactly as we were saying. There is an acknowledgement now, which I've seen over the past few years, of that imbalance and injustice that is built into our current system. And if I were to put that transport lens, it is the single biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, including carbon, and central to the damage that we are doing to our planet. And in Edinburgh, we have made we have a challenge of going net zero by 2030, and our transport policies and practices have to change, and we know that status quo is not an option, and I'm really pleased that that has been acknowledged across the political and partners at a city level. So last June, our city approved the climate strategy, the 20-minute neighborhood strategy, and the outcomes for that put people, movement, and place at the heart of transport. That which is brilliant, because it's no longer just about getting from A to B. It is about equity, it's about climate change, it's about well-being and inclusion, which is exactly what we need to do when we put that place lens on our city. We're looking at the strategy sets out keeping how you keep people and goods moving within the city, but it reframes the language around movement and puts that place lens on it, which is something that I'm really proud of. Because making a street and neighborhood, we all know this in this room, a shopping district for everyone means creating more space, more time, more greenery, less stress. I'll just end by this wonderful quote that Maya Angelou said. She said, "Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better." And I think all of us here now, we know better. We know that we can do better. So I'm really pleased that we're here together. We can start to explore some of these issues, and I can take some of the learning back from what we're doing collectively into my new job in Edinburgh. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion and learning from each other and learning how we can do better together.
Next up, as he scribbles the books, is Dr. Simon Jackson. Simon Jackson is a historian of the colonial empire with a special focus on the Middle East and the Mediterranean in the 20th century. He works on the discourse and politics of economic development in the French League of Nations mandate in Syria and Lebanon, and on the history of Fordism in the Ottoman Middle East, in the post-Ottoman Middle East, and on the global history of colonial commodities and natural resources.
All right, so folks, a big thank you first of all to John, to Brick, to Nathan, to my fellow panelists, including the folks on Zoom. Hello to all the folks on Zoom. I am here, I guess, in my capacity as a historian. Should I just stand right? It's okay. And what I'm going to try and do is kind of building actually on the Maya Angelou quote, doing as well as you can, knowing better, and then doing better. I'm going to try and do a little dialogue between present and past. I'll talk about a case study that I've researched on, which has to do with public space, battles over public space, mobility, and then I'll come at the end and at the beginning to talk about right now. So right now, a bit of past historical research, and then finish with right now. That's the plan. So, I was teaching some of our undergraduates earlier in the week, and we were talking about what effective history is. And I have this quote at the top about what it means to do effective history, learn effective history. And I think it's kind of like what Maya Angelou says. It's from another thinker, but it says, effective history and effective historical research is not about discreetly hiding in front of what you're looking into. You've got to give equal weight to your present moment. You've got to give weight to the life you're experiencing and to your present moment and to our present day concerns when you choose what you study and when you choose what you research. So there's got to be a dialogue between your present concern and your past object of study, okay? And this is my present concern. This was my morning. This is where I was coming from. I was coming up here to Birmingham from where I live, and I dropped my kids at school first of all, and we have a school street at the school that I've been involved with as a parent volunteer. You can see a photo of that there on the left. It was a beautiful morning. The car parked inside the school street couldn't get out until 9 a.m. Drop-off went pretty well. I was in a bit of a rush, but it was fine. And then I was on the train coming in, and I got an email from Living Streets alerting me to the fact that Kwasi Kwarteng is going to try and slim down the budget for active transport, and how we need to contact our MPs to try and push back against that. And Living Streets was talking about how there's a strong economic case for active travel, walking and cycling. So there's an economic logic there, and I think other panelists have talked about that already. The school street that I'm involved in is fragile and strong at the same time. It came out of the COVID crisis, and I think we've already talked a lot about crisis and how it can open space to do things a little differently, but also how that can close up again after, or when the crisis seems to be receding. It's a mixture of agencies. You know, there are volunteers, there are school authorities who are overstretched and don't have time and don't have budget. There's a local council that similarly has some budget but not a lot of time. There's an urban mayor, there's a national government, of course, that we all know about. There are NGOs, there's media representation, and there's algorithms like the Google Maps algorithm, which is sending drivers down back streets all the time, right? And which you can also kind of alert to the existence of a school street. So this is where I was coming from. This is where I was coming from when I was thinking about my research, and I thank the organisers for giving me that opportunity to try and be slightly more effective in my thinking. Here's my historical example. It's from the early 1920s, and it's not in Birmingham, it's in Beirut, in Lebanon. So it's a very different time, it's a very different place, but I still think on that principle of effective history that there's lots here that we can take and learn from. There was a tram system, 5 lines, coming from the suburbs into the centre of the city. It was built before the First World War, and it was a time when Beirut was becoming bigger. It was urbanising, peripheral villages were being kind of swallowed up into the city, and the city was becoming a commercial hub. There was a general enthusiasm among the population for modern transport systems. Everybody liked them, everybody could see the advantage of shared public transport, everyone was into it. But the devil was in the details. And the tram system was built initially before the First World War, and then it was owned by foreign capital investors. It was built by foreign construction companies, and it was controlled by local political elites and wealthy investors, right? The results of that structure were high ticket prices for users, high dividends for the owners, and regressive impacts for the most marginalized people in that city who were trying to get around, who were trying to move around and live their lives. Specifically, students, young people, working class commuters from the peripheries of this expanding city. You can see an image here of the tramway during the 1922 boycott, which is being ridden by these skeletons. And the caption says, you know, it's the skeletons talking, and they say, let the company recognize our lobby and not the customers. And it's the lobby of the owners and the managers, not the customers, right? But then the caption goes on, but after the arrests on the trams, only ghosts will ride. And during the 1922 boycott, the people of the city refused to ride the tram, and it went around empty, and the company lost more and more money every day, okay? So it was a battle over mobility and circulation of public space. What were the dynamics of the boycott? Remember, when I'm talking about this, the general population loved the trams, they loved collective public transport, but they objected to private ownership by foreign investors, and they objected to high fare prices, and they objected to foreign ownership. Okay? The key context was this context of crisis, which I think kind of opens the door for collective action and for a moment of trying to change the politics of mobility and public space in Beirut in the early 1920s. It's an economic crisis. Cost of living is super high, there's inflation. It's an epidemiological crisis. The so-called Spanish flu is circulating. A lot of people have suffered, a lot of people have died. And it's a crisis of traditional patriarchal order. Bosses, fathers, chiefs, and senior male politicians are all kind of in crisis because of the First World War that's just happened. So there are resonances here with COVID in the sense that the crisis opens the door to a moment of contestation about how public space should work and how people should move through a city. That's the kind of the lesson, if you like, on the context. Where does it get organized? It happens in suburban cafes. These are the crucibles of the boycott movement. The key figures, people like cafe owners, local lawyers, and people who get elected in an improvised way onto local boycott committees. And they organize their neighbors, right? They kind of crystallize collective neighborhood recognition of the situation, and they take charge of it, and they lead it. And that model then replicates from neighborhood to neighborhood, often in these working class suburban neighborhoods around the city center. Does that make sense? Existing political elites, mayors, people who work with the imperial authorities are cut out. Existing political parties and even sometimes labor unions and nationalist groups, they're all cut out of this. So there's an interesting dynamic going on where there's a kind of new legitimacy for the social movement, and existing elites are kind of marginalized in that. But I think there's something there as well in terms of grassroots organizing that's interesting for us. You can see the demands on the screen: fares to be cut in half, services to run later, to help returning commuters, striking tram workers to be bargained with, and the organizing process is really flexible. Some of the boycott members are the leaders are jailed, and then they're replaced right away by new leaders. It's a kind of replacement of those leaders on the fly. Nationalist and labor movements, existing ones, try to muscle in on the boycott and take charge of it, increasingly successfully, but not at first. The trams run empty. Fruit and tomatoes are thrown at people who try to get on them, and they move along their lines around the city, empty, losing money for the company, like a kind of symbol of public solidarity against them. What's going on with cars? Cars are quite new, right, in the city at this time, early 1920s. There are not many of them, but there are more and more. And they have a kind of double role. First of all, cars are used as shared taxis during the boycott to replace the trams. People need to get around. But they're also used in a kind of insidious way by existing elites who drive around during the boycott, and they offer rides to people, especially people whom they consider to be vulnerable. Nuns, small children, and these elites are trying to get credit for that, right? They're trying to recover their political position by showing off in their cars and giving lifts to people who they think most need them. So cars are doing at least a couple of things in this context, right? Remember, most people don't want cars. Yeah, they want to get back on the trams, they just want a fairer tram system. So the automobiles are a kind of risky alternative. And you can see a popular boycott song here from Asad Hattez from 1931. It says, "They believe, O tramway, that we're powerless against you and that we cannot do without you. That's a mistake. The automobiles are there and the oil too. You'll be better off giving in or else it's bankruptcy." So again, cars are playing a really ambiguous role here. They're a replacement that people will embrace because they have to, but they want to get back on the trams just on fair terms. Okay, and you can see some of the cars from the early 1919, 1920 there in the streets of Beirut. I'm just going to skip past the interpretations by historians because I think I'm running out of time. I can come back to this in the Q&A, but I just wanted to flag one quote from the urban theorist Henri Lefebvre. I think it's a great quote. He said, "The city and the urban sphere are the setting of struggle. They are also, however, the stakes of that struggle." So the city is the setting for struggle, and the city is also the stakes. The winner of the struggle, as it were, gets the city. And then I just want to pull another quote out from my colleague Kristen Monroe, who teaches in Kentucky, and she says, "Scenes of getting around the city are in fact sites of uncommon civic significance that produce and are produced by urban citizenship in a place where, and a time when, everyday life is framed by forms of insecurity." So when we're on the bus, when we're getting around, when we're cycling in with other families who are also cycling, these are kind of points and sites, places where urban citizenship can be created. So just to conclude, last slide, what can we see here? We can see in this case study of early 1920s Beirut, ambiguity, the ambiguity of economic and local solidarity. It was inclusive, it was new, they built those boycott committees, and they organized their neighborhoods, and they excluded existing elites. But it could also be exclusive. The leadership, for example, of the boycott remained predominantly male, and there was a crisis of patriarchal order, but the response to that crisis also reinstated patriarchy very often, right? Spaces were also stacked. The local neighborhoods that I'm talking about were kind of the bottom layer, if you like, in a stack of other spaces, which goes up through the urban, the national, the imperial, and on. But that doesn't mean that the local was powerless. The local could change everything from the urban to the national to the imperial to the globe, changing at all levels. And finally, that point that I made on the previous slide, that scenes of mobility are sites of civic significance where urban citizenship is forged and contested. So whether it's by the school street barrier, whether it's riding in with other families or other folks, whether it's those conversations on the bus, at the ticket barrier, paying those high ticket prices that we will pay, these are sites of civic significance, and I think we should embrace them and make the most of it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Features, curation, and producing, while also touching on intersections of queerness and blackness. Danni is a co-founder and curator at Civic Square, a public square, neighborhood lab, and creative and participatory platform focused on regenerative, civic, and social infrastructure within neighborhoods. Civic Square works alongside the local neighborhood to offer a bold approach to visioning, building, and investing in civic infrastructure for neighborhoods of the future. Danni?
So yeah, thank you for the intro. It's really weird. Sometimes when I get to it, I'm like, oh yeah, I do that. So I just kind of wanted to start from this idea of civic infrastructure and how we kind of look at that at Civic Square. I think at the heart of that it is around people thriving where they live, and that might be, you know, in your 5-minute kind of neighborhood, it might be a 10 neighborhood, it might be in the whole city, and how you kind of interact with all of those spaces that you can get to in certain amounts of time. And I think it's really important when we're kind of talking about public space that we acknowledge what that means in the cities that we also live in, because it changes from city to city, it changes from like country to country. So at Civic Square, a lot of our work is really tied into economic structures and framework that looks at our social kind of needs, our planetary needs, and actually what happens when we don't meet those and we fall in the middle of a donut, if you imagine a donut, 2 circles, and what happens when we kind of overshoot our planetary boundaries as well. So within that space, that's kind of going to be tied to everything that I said today. I'm on notes on my phone, so if I keep looking down, that's what's happening. No text messages, just right. So where I kind of wanted to start is before Civic Square, we were in Birmingham, which was a space where people could kind of come and incubate their ideas, and it was a real space of community. But one thing that kind of I learned while working there was we had Fresh, and it was like really amazing children just kind of exploring who they are, what they are, and community, regardless of kind of age. And we did some kind of like little feedback kind of studies. And when kids were talking about cars, or talking about how they get to school, or talking about these really normal things, and I know Tom, you like described it as being like these mundane, normal, day-to-day things. You know, we saw kids talking about, you know, cars being really smelly, or they're being on the pavement and they're trying to get to school. And, you know, a lot of people may say, oh, well, that's, you know, adults talking about cars being awful and they're spreading some kind of rhetoric. But actually, when we listen to children, when we see them as active citizens, when we see them as people that are participating in their everyday, that is a moment where we're given the opportunity to say, oh, we need to think about that. We need to think more about that. And you will see images of kids in like high vis standing like beside the pavement, and they're like talking to parents after school about like parking here, or you know, if you walk past the school, you'll often see little signs that are encouraging people not to park there. For me, when I see that, I do start to think about how we kind of start to subsidise a lot as citizens. We subsidise this information, and we go, well, we're not seeing things done, so we have to do it ourselves. And I think there's definitely power in that. I think it's amazing, but I also think it's a rocky road to be on, when we are only able to take matters into our own hands, and we don't feel the support of actual infrastructure of the city. And I think that's something really important around acknowledging that, you know, we do have to see it as a structural issue as well. And the activism that we do alongside that should be like a cherry on top, right? It should be a bonus that we get to use our voices or our art or anything to kind of, to make change. So another thing that I wanted to kind of touch upon around public space was also like in very specific to Birmingham. I'm not going to talk about the city that I know. We have so many public spaces that are privately owned. I think within that, we need to also acknowledge the intersections of that. If a space is privately owned, even though it may look public, there is also those spaces are often presented in a way that makes other people not feel comfortable of like, oh, I can go there. So actually the space that we're talking about being public, it's quite questionable, because public space, anyone should feel that they can go there. If you have a public park, anyone should feel that they can go there. You should be able to let your kids go, and you know that they're okay, right? Or that they could run home, or that you could run over there and do whatever. There's something really important about that actually when we're looking at what public spaces, we're also looking at what private spaces ultimately. And that's a real question that we need to kind of hold to the forefront and hold those tensions. I think when we hold the tensions, when we look at these sticking points, that's actually when we really start to acknowledge what people are feeling in their everyday. And that might not always be conscious, but that is something that could be coming in their brains, and that is also something that means, you know, they may not even access a space that looks public. And on that kind of note, I wanted to speak a little bit about Cannon Hill Park. I recently learned the story of Cannon Hill Park, and I can't remember this person's name, which is ridiculous, but there was a family that kind of owned what is now Cannon Hill Park, and the woman basically didn't get married, was seen kind of a bit as a bit of an outsider, but decided to make sure that Cannon Hill Park, and all this estate that was owned by her family, went into being public space. And if you've been around Cannon Hill Park, you feel that it is, you know, there's so much going on there. There's always lots of different people, lots of different activities going on. There's always people roller skating and cycling through, and kids running, and you know, the fact that like the Mac is there as well. There's always a hub of a being. And when it comes to private space, I do think that, you know, we have to acknowledge that if people have the privilege, the money to actually invest in what spaces could be made public, I think that's a real point that needs to be kind of thought about as well. And we have to kind of look at what that means to share that we're already a city of micro stressors. Like there's just micro stressors everywhere, which is very common in lots of cities. But I think then adding a layer on top of that, there not being as much infrastructure for people who are using active travel, we just layer on another kind of element of people not wanting to be out in public space. And if we're not creating spaces where you feel that you actually want to be outside of your own home, I don't think there's much hope. But I do have hope, and I do think that we can start to like push through these things. But it's just an added layer where people don't feel that they are part of community. And you know what you see a lot is in cars is that you are in your individual bubble. You're there. You don't have to really acknowledge that you are part of the world outside of you. And when that happens, you kind of start to lose the spirit of place. And you start to lose the spirit of community and of each other. Whereas obviously when you are actively travelling, one, because of how bad that infrastructure is, you are so alert of what's going on around you all the time. But what about being so alert because it's so joyous to be travelling around the city because you want to like look at what else is around you, you want to engage with things. That's a lot of the work that we do at Civic Square. We're looking for that joy, looking for that thriving space for communities and for people. How long for time? I'm about minutes. Great. More time. So one of my kind of last points really is also looking at the intersection of race, of gender, of sexuality within public space. There are so many people that already feel strange about public space because they feel that it's not for them, that they are already marginalised in a space outside of their home. And when we think about that, we have to also think about what message does that then start to create for people if they feel like actually, I don't want to get stopped by the police for just being, or for just being black, or for just being queer, or for just being. How do we kind of bring more of an educational space around who public space is for? Because we can feel it in our hearts and our minds, but actually if we're not speaking about it, if we're not kind of saying, oh, actually, yeah, I know why you don't feel comfortable, we have to take our kind of shame and ego out of it and actually go, okay, I'm looking at why I might feel comfortable in a space and you might not, and how we start to kind of unpack that as a collective. It's really important. And then my last point would just be that there are ways that exist, right? We know that there are things that we can do on our roads that actually start to create space for more collective togetherness. There's York Road in Kings Heath, which is pretty cool at the moment, and we've got loads of kind of placards around that are beautiful planters. There are beautiful ways to do these things, and I think a big part is to make the revolution irresistible. That is something that I really stand by, and how we kind of go into that. So yeah, we have these things, and I hope from this kind of talk today and tomorrow, that second part of this series, that we get to start to kind of unpack some of that as well.
Thank you. I wonder if we could pause 1 second here to see if there are any questions that emerge amongst the panel to the panelists themselves before we open it up to a general Q&A.
I just like how you just said the revolution, you have to frame it as irresistible. I just really like that.
Yeah,
I have a question for Daisy.
Yeah, I don't know if Tom,
Oh, maybe
we might have
she
to
won't.
pass the lapel mic here,
Oh,
so people at Zoom can hear us.
Oh, yeah, right. Daisy?
I think she's
Yep.
Oh, hey, Daisy, I just had a question. When you referred to the changing language in your space right now, what you were actually referring to?
Yeah, so essentially we're talking about transport has always been seen as, getting from A to B. So any transport project, any business case that you build for transport has to be about the quickest way to get from A to B. And we are changing that completely, because what we're trying to say now is that actually it's not just about getting from A to B, it's about well-being, it's about inclusion, it's about equity, it's about climate justice, it's about people. And I think reframing the discussions around what is the vision for traveling for people on bikes or on foot or public transport in Edinburgh, it's not just about getting from A to B, it's about enjoying your journey as well. So the language around that, the way we speak about, about journeys, about trips, all of that is rooted in people and place, not just movement. And also just to pick up the point around funding. So, for example, the city centre transformation project that I led, that essentially what we're trying to do is making it more difficult to take your car to get to places, easier to walk and cycle. But in terms of the traditional business case that that you have to create to make the economic argument for building these projects, that doesn't stack up, because what we're doing actually is making that car journey longer. So what we then did was to put a well-being lens on that, so quality of place and quality of life, and then we built the business case around that. And again, that was a change in narrative, a complete shift in how we look at transport. And it was amazing to see how, as soon as you do that, suddenly you take people along with you. You're not just talking about transport as a thing, we're talking about how people live. And that was really exciting, actually, to see that shift happen.
This is a kind of thought for the other panelists, but it seemed like a lot of what we were, something that came up in several presentations was how to make a grassroots movement institutionalize, and how to institutionalize our movements in, not just in public space, but in public realm, right? On councils, how these movements can hold power and shift the rules in a lasting way. Because I think in all of our stories we've seen a lot of energy, revolutionary energy, especially in moments of crisis, and then whether it's in all of these cases, the challenge is to institutionalize and to kind of have powerful positions that last. So I would just like put that out there.
I mean,
Maybe. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one could argue that Living Streets is kind of institutionalised in a way, because we've been campaigning since 1929, and so we are part of this fabric, societal fabric, trying to make the place for walking and better walking environments. But I think it's constantly renewed by the communities who are making those campaigns their own at a local level and at a national level. And if anything, communities, the key thread for me about who public spaces are for, they're for people when they come together, and it's what we make when we come together, which is really important, because you don't get that exchange of ideas and that social connection when you're in individual vehicles. It just doesn't happen. So you need that place of exchange in order to build society, which is what we all want to be part of. And it's constantly renewed through our actions, both as NGOs, as local community action groups, government bodies, etc.
Can I just jump in there, just to add to what Rachel said? Sorry. It's interesting. I've gone from being an activist campaigner to now working for the city, and it's really, it's quite a shock to me to see how systems work within local government, because the pace of change is quite slow. And I understand that now a bit better, because it is public money we're in charge of, and there's a whole lot of so many things that the council has to deal with. So I understand it a bit better now than when I was a campaigner, but it doesn't make me any less angry at times that we can't just move. This is the decade of delivery. We don't have much time with the climate crisis. There's a drumbeat of the climate crisis, constantly there. So for me, I keep talking about, collaboration. It sounds cliche, but it's the only way, and true meaningful collaboration, which is messy, which is difficult, which is, you don't agree all the time, that, robust discussions, so to have that collaboration, the building of trust. Danny, I just love what you were saying there about, making sure that how do communities, you don't feel isolated or that you're having to fight these battles alone. The city needs to come in and help you and to be part of that. And I think for me that building of trust is so essential to make that meaningful collaboration happen.
Okay, so I think there's probably lots of questions in the audience, and so we can probably turn to the audience now. And Kate at the back will also get any questions for those of you who are joining us. You're not? There's no questions. There's no questions from the Zoom people. Yeah, I think I might have to do